religion and spiritual practices can bring a lot of healing and bring a lot of purpose and sense of self. But when we kind of combine that with trauma, that's where we get into this kind of idea of religious trauma. Because if there are early attachment woundings and there are feelings of not knowing who you are and not having that stable sense of self, that's where that religious trauma comes into play.
Welcome to another episode of Entrepreneurs in Recovery. I am very grateful you're here today. Today is another special episode that I am conducting with Dr. Keean. And some of you may have listened to the last episode with Keean. And this is our second episode of probably a 10-part series with Dr. Keean, where we're going to explore all these different topics that are very meaningful to me. And I know some of you are submitting your questions or asks to some of the topics you'd like us to get into. And this one today is very special. But before I get into that, would you please go and like and subscribe to the YouTube channel and leave a review on Spotify or iTunes for this show. It really helps people to reach this show, especially new listeners, people who may really benefit from the healing tools and the techniques and these incredible guests that are coming on and sharing their gifts with us. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. So getting back to this episode today, today's episode is about religious trauma. There's many people out there who have experienced different types of trauma growing up, either in a religious household, and there are different types of programming and things that were beyond our control with our belief systems. And eventually, as an adult, we started to explore those and maybe evolve into new belief systems. And it doesn't make it right or wrong. It's just a really informed conversation. And Dr. Keean is just brilliant when it comes to this topic and uncovering these layers. So once again, this is an incredibly vulnerable episode. Me sharing and uncovering my own religious trauma and being able to share this with you is something I've been waiting to do for a very long time, but I really couldn't do it till I was ready. So I hope you really enjoyed today's episode. Thanks. Dr. Keean, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Yeah, welcome back again. And we don't really have a name for this, what we're doing here, but it's just going to be multiple episodes as we talk about some of these topics that are really important. And they're important for several reasons. One, because they're extremely relevant to many people, and they're relevant to me. And I don't want to speak to things if I don't understand them. That's why I bring guests on, and I ask questions, and maybe I'll read a book or listen to a podcast, but I don't know as much about a lot of the topics. But some of these topics we're going to talk about, I have firsthand personal experience, and I want to, dive into them. And we've unraveled a lot of these topics together. So that's really the goal with this docu-series or whatever we're calling this. Is we're just documenting and talking about these topics. And honestly, it is sort of the request of the listeners too, because you can look at the comments and things from our very first episode, and people are like still commenting today, in fact, saying, wow, thank you so much. And that episode we did in October? Or no, like August of last year. So yeah, this is round 3. And, if anyone's listening, they can go back and listen to the first episode with you before you were the doctor. And even though you already were the doctor, you didn't have the official completion, and now you do. And not that changes things, but it's fun now to call you Dr. Keean.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's nice to get into this transition, and after just years and years of work and self-exploration and self-reflection, it's really been a huge part of my journey. So it's exciting to be at the end and have this kind of behind me. Yeah.
Absolutely. What a journey. And, for those who are listening for the first time, Keean is the holistic therapist on Instagram. And that's where I found him with his content and his posts. And I was really struck by the what was being said, and I followed you for months, and then eventually I reached out to you. We started working together, and that's where we're gonna go today. We're gonna kind of pick up on the stuff we've done and work together, but also your posts and how that all connects and relates, and dive into that. So with that said, one of the things that we have talked about a lot is this idea of, and again, trauma. The word trauma gets used a lot now. It's a very profitable word to use, but we have to call things what they are sometimes. And this topic and idea of religious trauma. And, I grew up in a household that, based on the traumatic circumstances of, my father leaving at 3 and like the stress my mom had on herself raising 3 boys on her own, obviously going towards religion and going to a father, God, and having that father figure, having that faith was a staple to keeping her together mentally. And so, obviously as a young child, I was, brought into that. I don't want to say indoctrinated, but brought into that. And it became part of my fabric of my being is to rely on this source outside of myself for all of the things that were happening from a young age. And, I look at a lot of that and I go, wow, that helped me survive a lot of things that happen. And also, now looking back, I can see where I was already someone who was giving myself away as like the nice guy, the empath, whatever, sensitive person, the other things you want to label. And when I wrap that into the idea of also this God source, higher being, or whatever, it becomes like I started to outsource everything to that. So no matter what I completed, it was because of God. It was no matter what. And I think like, you fall into some issues with that, because when I was trying to also feel my emotions and try to be not so intense and stoic at times as I can be, it's because even the emotions were outsourced to God. So maybe we could just start there, and then we can kind of get into this for people to understand.
Yeah. And I think that's a good example, right? Because, in a lot of people that have had childhood trauma, and we've talked about this, is, they will end up kind of, whether a parent left or, there's been strife in the family system, there's this needing to find regulation through God and through spiritual experiences, and really not having, much of that stable sense of self without that part, right? And God kind of becomes the emotionally available parent that they never had. And it really becomes something of, a sense of, this is my stability, right? This is something that I can find grounding with. This is something I can assigning, meaning and beauty and emotional structure to when it comes to, relational experiences. And when I talk about religious trauma, I want to make the distinction, right, that for some people, religion and spiritual practices can bring a lot of healing and bring a lot of purpose and sense of self. But when we kind of combine that with trauma, that's where we get into this kind of idea of religious trauma. Because if there are early attachment woundings and there are feelings of, not knowing who you are and not having that stable sense of self, that's where that religious trauma comes into play, right? Because the person who doesn't have that stable sense of self because of the trauma they experienced is going to then externalize, right, a lot of their identity into God and into these spiritual experiences that they've had, because it's living out that vicariously through the experience. And if we have someone who has a father wound, right, that father wound is going to come up in their relationship with God, right? It's going to come up in their experiences with God. And in the way that we talk about religious trauma, there are a lot of different lenses to look at it from. But one of those lenses is that, right? It's where the father wound is there, and this is how we relate to God, right? And it's an unconscious connection, right, to the male gender, how we relate to the male gender. And if we've had experiences with punishment and we've kind of been in this loop of trying to get, forgiveness, and let's say we have, a parent that is really struggling with, mental health issues, and they have a fear of abandonment or a fear of engulfment, or, a personality disorder, that parent is going to be our reference point for God. And we're going to take on this unconscious role of being the child and not really being able to individuate from the parent, right? We kind of stay in that role as being the child and being in that non-threatening space and not having our own autonomy. And so that's not the case for everybody. And I want to be sensitive when I say that, right? Because other people's experiences can be different, but we're talking about people that have been affected by trauma and early attachment woundings that now have this relationship with their spirituality, with God, if that makes sense.
Yeah, which is obviously why we're having this discussion. And to go back, when I was young, my dad left and he never came back. There was no relationship. There was no replacement dad in his place. So I had that father wound, which is a masculine wound, which in the Abrahamic religions, Christianity and many of them, it's a masculine figure, right? It's a God that's masculine. So that's this father type, this archetype of a father. And so having that wound early on, it obviously affected my relationship with God and what God was, and very angrily at God, because even though I had this dependence, because that was the emotionally safe parent, was the father, God, I became very upset when things didn't seem to make sense and go my way, because I didn't have the demonstration of that father or masculine presence in my life. And many people do have that. So when they think about God or even just believing in spirituality, they're like, it's a solid rock, because it's like, oh, I had that. I had the support. I had the emotional regulation. I had the empathetic witness in my father, in my mother. And when you don't have that, you're going to, it's going to get really complicated at times when events happen. They don't go the way you think they are, or you don't individuate into your own sense of being and your own sense of, okay, this is who I am. This is who God is. This is who my mom is. This is who my dad is. Like, when it just gets kind of blurred together of like, my personality and who I am is very, very dependent on this idea of this God, which then I'm told that the God is punishing. So it makes it even worse when you start getting into pornography as a teenager or younger, or you start to be like, I'm going to get punished by the Father of God, so that's, for people listening, that's where I'm coming from. So you can understand that's where it is. And many people listening may have had an absent father, or there could be a wounding there. And, maybe that you rebelled, you became agnostic or atheist or whatever it is, because of that, or you went to new age spirituality, whatever. There's no judgment. It's just, we're having an open conversation about what happened.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that, right? Because that is the reaction for some of us. And, if you think about the instability, and when there's a fragmentation of the self of an emotionally immature parent, they have this kind of belief that, who am I without you, right? When they infantilize themselves onto their child and they kind of don't allow for that individuation that you mentioned, that's really a lack of this internal continuity where the self can kind of feel like a moving target. So it's this constant pull to kind of define oneself through other people. This is especially through like their children or intimate partners or family members. And this unconscious belief is, without you, I don't know who I am. And if I can keep you emotionally tethered to me, even, subtly, I still exist. And so you see this with emotionally immature parents, where the child tries to individuate, have a separate sense of self, and they have that fragmentation of self, which has kind of been projected onto the child as well, right? And so then when you bring God into that, right, it turns into this compulsive response to fear of abandonment, where you grow up as the child of that parent, and now you're starting to battle with that internally, right? Who am I without God, right? Without God, I don't know who I am, and if I can keep God emotionally tethered to me, even subtly, I still exist. So if you go back to that example, there's these compulsive responses to that fear of the abandonment, right? So there will be that cycle of shame, and then you do something that you feel bad about, or you feel judged by God, and then you go back into the compulsion of I need to kind of put out this big bid for psychic coherence to help externalize and stabilize the internal chaos that you're experiencing by assigning meaning and beauty and the emotional structure to your relationship with God. And as long as you do that, even if you are in the compulsion of feeling that fear of abandonment and repenting and going into that cycle, then you can maintain the connection, right? Because just like the parent, there's that fragmentation of the self in your relationship with God, right? So that's the kind of where we see a lot of religious trauma. And of course, that doesn't sum it up, but that's one of the examples. And when someone has that fragmentation of self, their relationship with God is going to look very different than someone who doesn't, someone who didn't grow up with a parent who has that lack of internal continuity, where there's that constant pull of, I need to define myself through my child. I need to define myself through my romantic partner or my family member. And so that becomes kind of the way we look at God.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a really important discovery that I started to work through with you. I had known about this, let's say this wound, which was tied to you could say religion. It was tied to religion because I would my sense of self was based upon my prayers, was based upon outcomes and things happening. And then if I felt abandoned by God, or I felt abandoned, there was this ultimate wreckage of my identity. There was a wreckage of like, what is real? What matters here? And I think, for those that grew up with stable parents, or even learned how to regulate through a sister or brother or an uncle or someone that found a way to regulate and self-regulate and come through, that is absolutely going to impact the way that you look at God in source. It's not like you're born in the image of God and then all of a sudden I just believe in God and I know exactly that's the way, the truth, and the life. You're not born like that. You're born and imprinted upon through your environment, your parents, authority figures, your friends. You're getting imprinted on your psyche, your ability to regulate, and you're then going, oh, okay, this is what God is to me. This is what, is. So it's a discussion that I was really grateful to have you on, because as I unravel and I start to individuate in my 40s and start to realize, wow, this is what I actually want and need. Not just the inspired Jesse, the future self Jesse, what's the me right now Jesse? What do I actually want? What do I need for my emotional needs and my support? I start to realize more and more that a lot of the things I thought I wanted were externalized through my relationship with God. And it became this like, well, what does God want? Well, what is God? How did I get my definition of God? Okay. And this is what we're talking about. Where did that come from? And so, and I used to argue with my mom when she would say, well, everyone needs to believe in Jesus Christ. And I'm like, what if you grew up in the Tibetan mountains and you never were exposed to that? What would you believe? Or what if you grew up in India? What if you how is that good? That's not how it works. You're imprinted in your programming is a big word that we use, is and to what your belief system is. This isn't like, this is like straight facts, right? And you come from those lenses of the 8 billion people on the planet, from these early influences and then later influences. And then you could even say what psychedelics can do later on to then smash your concept of your beliefs that you grew up in as a child, that you either accepted or rebelled against, or created your own version of what your higher source and God is today.
Yes, absolutely. And, I think that the other piece of that too is that, like, when you think about a parent that is not stable and they don't have that stable sense of self, there is that kind of the idealization and then the devaluation, which we've talked about before. But when the idealization of God happens, it's you're the only safe haven I know. And this is something that becomes a compulsion to kind of protect ourselves from feeling any of the grief, the shame, the guilt, the sadness, right? Because after a rupture where we make a mistake, and we're not perfect, we mess up. After that rupture, instead of integrating the grief, the shame, the guilt, the sadness, the unconscious mind often returns to kind of idealization as a defense. And it's this narrative of, if I can remember, you as sacred, and our connection or our love or devotion to each other as transcendent, I don't have to face my shame or my part in the rupture, right? I don't have to look at what's coming up for me or any of these compulsions. I just look at the transcendent nature of the relationship and go back to, that connection to God, whatever it looks like. And then I don't have to face the part of the rupture that happened, right? So that's that fantasy re-idealization. And it's this idea of this emotional purity that we can return to, right? And it helps us avoid the unbearable complexity of the losses of these things in our lives that make us feel shame because of the conditioning, right? And then you go into that idealization as a defense against feeling the shame and the self-loathing that comes from, like, sinning or making a mistake or not being seen as good in the eyes of God, or the, which is modeled after the caregiver or the parent.
Yeah, and what we're really talking about, right, is this idea that, okay, I have done wrong. Like, literally, I did something wrong as an adult, let's say. And instead of being like, whoa, I really need to process this grief and these emotions and integrate this experience, instead you go to the blood of Jesus, or you go to the love and light, or you go to the transcendent psychedelic experience where you became oneness. And it's like, well, no, I can give it over and I'm forgiven. I have my sins atoned. I don't have to, I'm always forgiven no matter what. And it's like, well, actually, if you don't feel that to heal that, and you don't work with someone to actually help you to process and regulate that, that's going to show up later on. And that's just basic psychology. It's like, it's going to show up later on as a psychic injury. It's going to be it's going to pop up in another area of your life. And it may pop up later on in an intimate relationship. It may pop up in these times where, you are about to go to sleep and you're like, oh, wow, that still hurts when I think about that. Well, it's because there's a term called spiritual bypassing. And that's a way to do that, is to use all these different things I mentioned to be able to not actually feel it. And I'm saying this out of incredible experience of doing this. And it took a huge rupture and fracture of my life path that I was on. And that, for me, early on, was interrupted by addiction. And that showed me, like, whoa, I did not feel this stuff. I remember my first therapist I was arrested, court-appointed therapist and lawyer, and I was talking to this therapist on session 1 at 22 when I just got arrested on serious charges for my addiction. And I just unloaded on her when she showed me that she was a safe space for me to do so.
Yeah.
And the reality, what I really was doing was just sharing all the stuff that I could never share in the household. I could never share. I didn't know what to do with it. And it was too much for someone to hold anyways. They were like, whoa, so a lot of times we wrap that under the carpet. We sweep it under the carpet of our, atonement, religious ways or even New Age, just to throw it under the rug, to be like, I am oneness and I am all. So love and light will just make that go into the great unknown. And it's like, well, I don't know if the body works like that in the way it keeps score.
Yeah. And I think, it makes me think of this. There's a lot of defense mechanisms for people that have had this trauma, and then it kind of transmits into religious trauma, and they go into these responses, right, that are unconscious, instead of repairing ruptures in relationships, right, because it's kind of modeled after their relationship with God or spirituality. They go into this defensive altruism, right? So it's kind of, this can be in the sense of like, if there's a rupture in a relationship, there can be, maybe instead of acknowledging the ways they messed up, or not, or just taking accountability, right? Instead of that, they're gonna kind of position a gift for you, or give you some kind of emotional bid, which says, I'm not going to appear needy because of the fear of rejection, and if I don't appear needy, I won't be rejected. And so, you see this with people who, the most classic example is like, there's an argument, there's a fight, and then instead of actually going into their accountability or what happened, it's kind of modeled after how they have their relationship with God and the emotionally immature parent. And they go into that defensive altruism as a way to kind of mask these deep needs under the guise of selfishness. Because beneath that is like this deep hope that, let this gesture pull you closer, right? I don't have to actually do the work to repair the negative things in the relationship, but instead I'm just going to kind of throw out this emotional bid. And that's not the way that we can repair in our interpersonal relationships, right? It's another form of kind of that fantasy re-idealization. We're going to stay away from anything that has to do with accountability or self-reflection. And so people that have had, religious trauma, or kind of have that way of thinking, they're not going to be able to repair conflict in the ways that are healthy if it's modeled after an unhealthy trauma experience that's kind of shaped or vicariously experienced through God or through their spiritual experiences.
Yeah, it's a lot of black and white thinking, right? It's black and white, where you can really oversimplify very complex issues. Like, even when we talk about addiction, you have many opinions about addiction, and
Yes.
and one of the opinions is, if we're going to tie it to like a way to heal addiction religiously with Jesus Christ, or ways that people actually have had healings with in that way, and to say that, oh, addiction, I just have to turn this over and all of it goes away. Well, guess what? Yeah, you can utilize that faith, which is very powerful and profound, to use your belief system of that, because as we know, you can actually visualize something and the brain believes it actually happened. That's how powerful the brain is. So if you have that faith of, this is now healed, yes, that can be profound in your actions and habits that you then move forward with to utilize the change that's going to happen. But that's oversimplifying the complexity addiction actually can cause. Because why did the addiction exist in the first place? It wasn't just because you liked fentanyl or just because you liked gambling. Like, this is a deeper rooted issue many times that is, oh, wow, this is actually stems from these needs, the way I was loved, these needs not being met as a child, or this is the way I got love. And so, addiction is oftentimes, right, pain. Like, why the pain? Why not? Why the addiction? Right. And so
Yes.
when we look at things as black and white like that, like, oh, I did all these heinous acts, but I'm forgiven by, God forgives me, I'm forgiven, and
Mhm.
I will just move forward. It's like, well, no, you're going to jail because you broke the law. And then you in jail, you could, use your faith to rebuild your life, but you're going to go to jail. So and it's just like the mental jail too. So people go to the mental jails, and then they have these own prisons that are created because we're
Mhm.
just bypassing what actually is the core and the root
Yeah.
of why did I cause this harm to myself and others? Why did I abandon myself? Why
Yeah.
did I pick up these habits and behaviors or addictions? And once we know the why behind it, and we can start to understand that, which can take years for some people, decades. It doesn't have to take that long, but it does for many, because it's so thickly embedded in the nervous system. It's so
Mhm.
thickly embedded in that person's way of being that it's part of their identity, the way they walk around in life. And so to just be like, oh, it's forgiven, or just, just do this and your addiction's gone. It's like,
Mhm.
well, I mean, that's extreme. And that means that we're not actually getting to what's really going on the core root of what is this disconnection and fragmentation? Where is it coming from? And then once we can have that understanding, then we don't have to bypass our actual emotions and feelings.
Yes, exactly. And, I think that people that, they get drawn into reenactments of childhood trauma, it's where an authority figure is present telling them what to do, how to think, what is the answer. It's kind of like you're looking for the neck that's going to turn your head where it needs to go. And we have to be careful, right? Because, there can be addiction to many things, and we also can get addicted to relationships. We can get addicted to people that are, give us that idealization. And for someone who's been completely, starved of emotional affection growing up, if that's the case in your childhood, right? This kind of fantasy re-idealization in the religious trauma piece really does fuel some of the spiritual bypassing when it comes to addiction, because we have to go into the pain to actually look at, okay, what is this addiction about? What need am I trying to get fulfilled that I didn't get met growing up? And how is it affecting me now? Because a lot of that, the way we look at addiction, the way we conceptualize it is there's a lot of shame around it. There's a lot of, I'm an addict, or putting these labels on the self. And sometimes it's not helpful to ascribe labels to ourselves because we stay within the confines of the label. And it's almost like an intellectual defense mechanism, right? Because if we kind of think about our brain looking for threats, what's safe, what's unsafe, the brain can put us into the safe label. And then we can kind of identify in that label, right? Instead of actually look at the pain, look at what's causing the addiction, what's fueling the loss or the grief behind the addiction, because the addiction is our way of finding that safety and finding that, that just kind of peace, and feeling that connection to the self, to slow things down and be back in the body. And sometimes it's about escaping the body. But the point is that with addiction, we're really, there's a lot of shaming ourselves. There's a lot of not understanding what does it mean to be addicted to something. Addicted to drugs, video games, sex, people, relationships. What does it mean to be addicted? Because there's this kind of notion that you're bad for that, you're wrong for that, you're damaged for that. But really, what it's showing is that you're seeking safety, you're seeking what you didn't get growing up. A lot of people that are addicted are looking for that safety, looking for that baseline of security, and they're getting shamed for trying to find it.
Yeah, well said. It's, this is where I come into a lot of times when I get asked, which is a question I get asked a lot. Like, how can I help my son, or how can I help my daughter, or how can I help my husband with their addiction? And, I know people want to have an answer that is, give me some Ozempic so I can lose 15% of my body weight, quick pill action. And I'm not trying to knock that pill. I'm just saying it's not a magic pill, and it's not going to happen very quickly. So the first step many times is the compassion, and the compassion that they have for themselves before they even go to help the addict or the person who's struggling with addiction. And I think, these are why the conversations like this are so important, is because I have people who have been struggling with alcohol for years, and they have kids and wives and families and all these things, but they still drink alcohol, and they do it in a way that's destructive, but they won't let it go. And alcohol is one example. We can now go into other addictions like intensity addiction. People are in addiction to the intensity that they create in their life, like crisis management addiction, like we talked about the last episode, where we're addicted to the adrenaline hit, the endorphin hit of creating crises, or we're addicted to the intensity of the next big wave to catch, the next big event we're going to do. These things that are happening, even in entrepreneurship, we see that a lot too. These addictions to these extremes of workaholism and making it happen. And so these can be extremely, destructive. And, that's what we're talking about in this discussion. We're talking about why. Let's get curious of why this is happening. And, it's easy to make it black and white, but then again, we're bypassing the gray areas of all these things to see, okay, why am I the way that I am towards my relationship towards God? And why am I the way I am towards my relationship towards my partner? Or why am I the way I am with my relationship to my father or mother? When we start to look at that, we can actually look at, wow, that's actually how I was come into my relationship with this God, the source. It's tied in. It's a very interesting discussion that I think for me has been very important to unravel, because at this stage, there's a lot there that I had to grieve. And we can maybe get into that, as the grief of once you come into that realization.
There is, yeah. And yeah, it is. There's a lot of grief. And, when you think about the relationship that some people have with God, is that in a sense, they are still trying to fix, right, what they couldn't fix with their original caregiver. And it's deeply somatic and symbolic, and they get into that loop of, really just wanting to have that proximity with God and the emotional repair, and hoping that this time, if they make a mistake, or, lie, or make some kind of, or have ill will towards somebody, right, that they need to have that repair after, to regulate themselves, to feel regulated and safe. And so this is about a lot of unresolved pain from long ago projected into the relationship with God. And this is not the kind of relationship with God where the love is unconditional. It's about trying to find and fix and repair what you couldn't with the parent, right? And so then you see people in those compulsions trying to resolve the pain from way back when.
Yeah, we talked before about critical thinking, and how with this type of religious trauma, like, it absolutely impacts your critical thinking, right?
Absolutely.
And maybe let's get into that a little bit, that there's a lot of times, like we get into, where you have this opportunity to integrate and heal these very big fractures that happened in your life, these moments of breakups, these moments of shame that you've had, these shameful moments you've created for different reasons. And instead of going into that and looking to heal and work with that, our critical thinking can often become blurred in the lines of ways to handle that, because we're going to just give it right over to this higher source. Okay, I'm just going to give it over. But what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
How is that actually going into this somatic work, or any of the work that we can start to utilize to start to... So yeah, I'd like to get into that a little bit. Mm-hmm. And then also, if you would, for the audience, this idea of idealization and devaluation, if you could also explain what you mean by that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you can remind me of the first question,
Yeah.
because I was like thinking about responding to your other statement that you made. But what was the first question?
Yeah, the first question is just how critical thinking can be impaired with this
Oh, yeah.
religious trauma.
Okay, yeah. So with critical thinking, when you think about that piece, it's impaired in the sense that because we're in those compulsive responses to fear of abandonment from the early childhood trauma, for the people that this applies to, right? The the critical thinking is really the prefrontal cortex, right? It's the logic, the reason, the rationale, and the decision making. If we've been in these compulsive responses for most of our life in trying to, feel more connected to God when we make a mistake or sin, we're in our limbic brain, right? And so we're in our limbic system. We're in the part of our brain that is in the emotional response. And so when we're in that, we can't access the critical thinking and the logic. And it kind of keeps us, we feel that if we stay in that space of the limbic, we're safe, right? And so it's like a trade-off. We don't want to exit that space because it's keeping us connected emotionally. But the prefrontal cortex is where we get grounded, we get logic and reason and rationale, and we're not in that space a lot when we're conditioned to think this way, right? It's very much more outside of that space. It's in the fantasy world. It's not in reality. It's not connected to reality. In fact, there's a lot of sayings or beliefs about being not connected to the world, right? Being more focused on heaven and more focused on the future and future thinking. And your brain is constantly trying to predict what's going to happen next. And so because of that, you're looking at your brain reacting to the sensory present and the past, right? And that's what it's reacting to. And if you have really been conditioned to not be in the sensory present, to really like disconnect from the present because your home is in heaven, for example, then you're not going to be able to access those parts as much because your brain is used to going in the loop in the other direction. It's used to being in the limbic.
Yeah, one of the things you just made me think of is my I used to talk about with my mom like eating, and overeating, and I'd be like trying to help her with that because she would ask me all the time. And so I would say, okay, well, you got to start a plan here, a plan of attack, which has been kind of my life mission, is to understand nutrition and holistic health practices. And I would start to help her with the plan, and then she would fail in the plan and said, my date is written in heaven. All the hairs on my head are counted by God. So the day that I'm leaving into the book of the life or whatever, my days are marked, so I can go and it's that rationalization of addiction. It's a rationalization of the behaviors. And that used to drive me insane, as you can imagine, because I'm trying to help someone, especially a parent, and then have that reaction of, well, my days are numbered according to the Bible, so I don't have to change, was basically what she was saying. And it's like, well, then what's the effing point of anything? And that sort of was again, we're going back to, you may have not experienced what I'm saying, people listening. I'm talking about religious trauma, like actual things that became very intense for some of my mind like that. And maybe someone who's listening like, yes, that's annoying to me too. That happens to me. But yeah, that's what you reminded me of when you just talked about that.
Absolutely. And that's a very frustrating thing, right? Because if you're trying to heal and be in a somatic experience and be in the present moment, and be connected to these sensory experiences, and then you're engaging with your mom, who is really much not in that space, right? Her brain is predicting threats, predicting safety, and is not able to really meet you where you're at, because there's this unconscious trauma response of making herself small and non-threatening, and in the being in the favor of the parent. of God, of being in that favor, right? And so in order to feel safe, it's almost like this age regression where then she would go into that space of, I will be the child and God will be my parent. And there's no reflection on my part in any of this stuff. It's kind of just like going back into the space of comfort, right? And that's that loop that we can find ourselves in when the relationship with God and religion or spirituality is combined with that type of trauma, right? Because it really is about how the trauma affects how you view the relationship with God and how you view the relationship with spirituality. Because in someone who has access to nuance and is not looking at the black and white, right, and isn't in that black and white thinking, they're going to be able to have a little bit more flexibility in their thoughts, in their ability to connect to other spiritual experiences. It's not going to be about predicting safety and disconnecting from anything that is a threat. It's going to be about being in the present and connecting to other people's experiences, not about predicting, is this a threat or is this not a threat?
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. So let's go back to the question of
Yes.
idealization and devaluation when it comes to, we know about it. We'll get into that if we haven't talked about this before in terms of people and relationships and certain personality disorders, but we're not talking about that now. Let's talk about that in relation to religion.
Yeah. So if we look at idealization, right, it's kind of like, to break that down at the foundational level, your brain is always asking, am I safe? Who can I trust? And this is just about predicting safety. So when someone has experienced this early relational trauma, neglect, inconsistent caregiving, the nervous system starts to develop this stable internal model of trust or safety in relationships. But this leads to this dysregulated attachment system. And so they're toggling between the extremes of closeness and distance. So that's where we get idealization and devaluation. You see that in personality disorders. So in idealization, it's you're everything I need to feel safe. And so if we look at the brain systems involved, there's the dopaminergic reward system that gets activated when a person or relationship seems to offer relief, love, or validation. And then the prefrontal cortex starts to overfocus on the positive traits, and it suppresses any threatening cues. And then the oxytocin starts to surge, and this creates this sense of intense bonding or safety. And what's happening is the brain is seeking refuge in the idealization, and the nervous system finds this safe haven, this person who seems perfect, often to kind of regulate overwhelming emotional states or fear of abandonment. And it's unconscious. It's less about the person and more about what the brain believes the person represents: security, identity, or survival. So from a religious trauma lens, right, this is what we see a lot with, anything that threatens that. We're going to break out of the idealization and then go into the devaluation. So we can idealize our relationship with God, and we can say, you're everything I need to feel safe. And then when we feel let down, or we feel hurt or betrayed, or something doesn't go right, a person with this type of trauma can go into the devaluation. So you're dangerous and I must protect myself, right? And when it comes to, someone who's been conditioned with religious trauma, they're gonna switch between those two lenses. And so all of a sudden, they might feel really unsafe, and it's very black and white thinking. So the brain systems involved in that is the amygdala, threat detection, and that activates with any perceived inconsistency or any emotional pain that's triggered. And then the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, heightens emotional pain from perceived rejection. And then the HPA axis, the stress response, floods the body with cortisol, and it prepares for defense or shutdown. So basically, when the idealized experience or the person shows any sign of not being perfectly safe, and there's disagreement or perceived distance or an unmet need, the brain like flips, and now that same person is coded as a threat. So the nervous system is trying to avoid emotional rejection, and it shifts to devaluation to protect the self. And so this isn't manipulation, it's survival, and it's fueled by the nervous system dysregulation, right? So it's not intentional, but this is what happens in the brain. And it's that rapid shift between reward and threat systems. And for people with complex trauma or disorganized attachment, those shifts can be frequent because the brain never learned to hold this ambivalence or complexity of safety. It's either all good or all bad, because coexisting those, it feels intolerably unsafe, right? And so they're not looking at the nuance of it. So when we look at idealization and devaluation, it's switching between those two ideas. And when we think about other spiritual experiences, that can immediately shut off any kind of connection to other spiritual things, if that is the process the person is in from the religious trauma.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. I'm sure some people wanted to hear that clarification. Like it's a really important concept to understand. And if that's the way things are operating for you, or are starting to make sense of what's happening in your own world and your own thinking. And I think another thing that we've talked about is this idea when we talk about individuation, and we talk about starting to have this connection with you and this deep sense of self-respect and love, and almost like we've talked about in the past, like being selfish, so that you can start to really go into these wounds that end up happening throughout the lifespan. Some of them you had no responsibility for. When you were a child, you were stuck in that situation. And then as an adult, some things you did and actions you performed or things you're ashamed of, to now be able to sit with that. And I think one of the things that is part of the individuation process is this idea of the authority figure. And, having the father wound is going to be a big one when it comes to this authoritarian God, and then having this complex relationship with authority. And, where you might rebel from authority figures and different people, but when it comes to God, the ultimate authority, there's this authoritarian complex that happens, and hence more shame, especially if I'm the child and that's the father. And then I watch pornography, or I have these shameful things, and maybe people are not ashamed of that, but there are people who are, and that's why you're listening. Or you have someone, a loved one, who is ashamed of that, and you're trying to understand better what's going on. Well, this is also this idea of the authority figure being God. And, so we have this nature, and maybe we could speak to that a little bit, because that's obviously something that I've been working and healing through as I continue to go into this journey of the nervous system, this healing. Because this episode is not to debate whether God is real or whether there's faith and whether there's miracles. And of course, it's not about that. It's about people's actual experiences that they're having and validating them and saying, yes, I've been there too. And yes, Keean is a licensed therapist. That is, he has dealt with many, many people that are going through these things. And we want to bring these conversations out.
So to clarify, I'm a pre-licensed therapist and doctor of psychology. So I just want to make sure that's clear. Because I have to.
Oh, well, then we can't do this. We got to stop. I'm just kidding.
But that just involves the long journey of school and the licensure process. But
sure.
So I think what's really great is the authority figure thing that you brought up, right? Because it really it gets replicated in our lives with other people. And then we end up because our relationship with God might be based off of these early traumatic experiences, then it's kind of distorted and it gets replicated with other people. So then we take on that unconscious role of, I'm the child and I need to have this authority figure in my life, and I need to, get their approval, and I need to get their safety or security or whatever it is. And so as a full functioning adult that's grown, a lot of people don't know that they haven't gone through the stages of adolescence, and they haven't gone through a lot of things because of trauma, because of early development attachment wounds. And so they seek out this authority figure to have that stability. And when it comes to God, right, if we look at our relationship with God as he is the ultimate authority, and it's very black and white, it leaves us in this space of fear of punishment, right? Fear of rejection, fear of abandonment. There's not unconditional love. It's when is the shoe going to drop? When's the next shoe going to drop? When am I going to do something bad and be out of God's graces, so to speak, and then get rejected and abandoned, right? But if we kind of start to implement our own authority in our relationship with God, and we can individuate from the parental dynamics we grew up with, then we can start to kind of combine that with our spiritual experiences, and we can kind of lead our life in the direction where we're going with our spiritual connection, with our relationship with God, but not as this authority figure that is going to punish us and that we have to, kind of be submissive towards when we make mistakes or we are human. If our relationship with God is based off of love and connection, and it's not this unconscious draw towards trying to get that authority figure to accept us or love us, it's a very different relationship with God. It's a very different relationship with spirituality.
Yeah, I just think that's important about the conditional and unconditional love, right? If it's
true, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that was really this is a really big concept for me to really start to understand and unravel why I idealize certain mentors and men and different people. It really started to make sense of how I was operating in my own world and putting people on pedestals and this idea of these authority figures. And because they have this mystical power like God, they have these things that I don't have. And so, yeah, it's a really interesting thing. And like, not even getting into, I mean, I've read, not that it makes me special, but I've read the Bible. I was, very involved in the church for a long time. And, even if you look at the words of Jesus, like, man, like it's pretty clear that there is not a authority figure here that he wanted you to worship. And, it was pretty clear from what I've read that, the works that Jesus did that you could do even greater. Pretty sure that's an exact quote from the Bible. Not exact quote, but an interpretation of a very, famous verse. I think it's John 14:12, right? It's, what I do, you'll do greater works. Well, that doesn't tell me that's an authority figure that I have no way of living up to. It sounds like to me, I'm going to do even greater works than what this most famous person ever, that is God to people, to ever live. And so I just say all that to say, like, these are things we're just exploring. We're exploring these things and saying, wow, this is actually relevant to the way that I believe of what God is, and, how these ideas of God were shaped, and influenced. It didn't just come out of like, my brain was like, and my spirit was like, this is God and this is what you will believe. It was talked about to me, this is God, this is what is to believe. And it was based on being brought to church and bringing into these different environments. Like, this is the way, this is the way. Like, oh, okay. And so, part of as you grow older, to individuate and say, okay, this is actually my version of God that's unconditional, that doesn't have conditions, that have this. And it's not to say that that's not the interpretation of many people who are religious. It's just based on your trauma and wounds growing up could really shape this idea of God. And I talked about with you, almost jokingly, but not jokingly, that God is my nervous system. And the reason I said that, because based on the safety I feel in my body is based on how I'm going to react and feel towards God or a loved one. Because if I don't feel safe in my body, I don't care who you are. I can't pray that away. Please, 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 I don't want to feel this way. It's like, it doesn't work. I've tried that. I have to be like dissociating from my experience or numbing out with addiction or something to regulate myself back to safety. So having this idea that God is my nervous system, I said that to say the nervous system is really directing the show. Like they say the unconscious is, but that nervous system is really profound. And there's many people listening like, I don't know what you're talking about. Well, that's because your nervous system hasn't been wrecked by different experiences that you induced or was induced on you as you grew through the years of childhood. So the people that are listening that are like highly sensitive souls, that their nervous system just with a loud noise can jump and they have these responses, I think you can maybe step into what I'm saying when I said, God is my nervous system. And that's what I meant at the time. And of course, that's, if you can see the context of where I was coming from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it just goes back to that idea that God, we want that to feel safe. We want safety around that. And it's just so, amazing, the stark contrast between somebody who may have had dysregulated parents growing up or caregivers that as they grew up and also learned about, spirituality and religious practices and belief systems, that was integrated into their trauma that they experienced. And so you can have somebody that has a very different experience with God and different definition of what does it mean to be in relationship with God, or in my spiritual practices in relationship with those. It's not a scary relationship. Maybe it's not one where there's a fear of abandonment or rejection, right? Because there's been a very strong sense of self growing up, and caregivers with a strong sense of self that doesn't shift based off of threats, and has given that child a very healthy relationship with their belief system, right? And their relationship with God looks very different from somebody who didn't have that safety, right? Because they're going to interpret all the experiences, and it's unconscious. They're going to be drawn to those experiences in their relationship with God, and their brain is going to be, as it is often predicting the behavior and predicting what's going to happen next. If you've got, trauma from a caregiver that abandoned you or rejected you, you're going to have fear that God is going to abandon and reject you. You're going to have fear, and you're not going to have a stable relationship with God. You're not going to have a stable relationship with a higher power or a spiritual experience, right? It's not going to be stable. It's going to be modeled after the original attachment. And so there are going to be people listening that do not feel that, right? Because they've had a very strong, they don't feel the rejection when it comes to their relationship with God, because they have a very strong sense of self that was formed in development, and they have strong attachments, and they're secure in their relationships, right? And so their relationship with God looks very different.
Yeah, and we already hit an hour. I'm like, man, there's so many nuances and directions I could take from this, from what you just said in the next conversation that I would like to have. But I think at this, what's that? Yeah, we'll put a bookmark.
Yeah.
Well, again, this is gonna be a multi-part series that we're doing together, and I'm excited to continue to utilize your experience, my experience, putting this together. And I think as we come to a wrap up, because we're going to continue on these conversations. And again, if people are listening and they're like, oh, I would love for you guys to talk about this or get into these topics after hearing this, or I resonated deeply about this, please, there's a little submission form in every single one of my episodes, and you can just click and put in a little, and you don't even have to disclose your name. Just say, hey, I want you to guys talk about this, or hit Keean up on Instagram at the Holistic Therapist, or me at my Instagram, Jesse Harless 222, and just ask us, and we'll get into some of these conversations that, are conversations I've never heard anyone talk about. And they're very important to me to go into, because they've unraveled and brought me a lot of peace. And that's where I want to go next. So as we come to the close here, what can people do to start to heal this religious trauma?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question. They can start to deconstruct what is an authority figure in my life. You know, they can start to deconstruct what was my early attachment experiences as a child. How did it model my relationship with God? How did it model my relationship with spirituality? And really look at how does that impact my current view of myself, my current view of, my spiritual experiences. Because if they actually go back and look at the early attachment experiences, it's going to mirror what they're experiencing now, right? And they're going to have a greater understanding around why they might have fear that God would abandon them or reject them, why they might, experience this compulsive response to the abandonment fears of, prayer after making a mistake or sinning or, messing up, right? They're gonna have a deeper, more nuanced understanding of that, and it's gonna open up some more dialogue around why my brain is doing what it's doing, right? Because it's really, and I like to empower clients with that, right? That you look at what your brain is doing to survive and take some of the you out of it. Because if you separate yourself and you don't make your identity in these trauma reactions or experiences, you can start to really look at the authentic self, and you can see what your brain has been doing in the background.
Yeah, and it's just like we've talked about in the previous episode. It's like, did I want to self-sabotage my life and show up in these ways in relationships? And no, my nervous system was behaving in that way. And it's like the accountability I have is to recognize that, whoa, that was like a hyper aroused state. That was like not who I am. I don't want to be dissociated. I don't want to feel this certain way to not feel the pain. But those were protective mechanisms that my nervous system utilized. So it's separating me from my nervous system and knowing that that's part of me. That's not who I am.
Yes, and so those reactions don't have to exist in your relationship with the higher power, with God, with spirituality. They don't have to exist in the same way they existed growing up.
Right. It can be unconditional love. It can be like, I separate my nervous system from this God, this higher source. It's unconditional. I'm so great. And then now we're kind of getting to that wholeness place of feeling whole and feeling, even that there's love that's never going to change no matter how up or down. And, it's separate from the way that I experience highs and lows and the way my nervous system operates. So it's getting to that deeper healing for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. And maybe we can do a collab post on, to open up the discussion for the next episodes.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to splice this up into some reels and stuff. We'll put this out there for people so that there'll be opportunities to do that. We'll do some collaborative posts. And I hope today's discussion was fruitful for those that needed to hear, and that this found you today, this message on YouTube or Instagram or wherever this is going to get out to you. So any closing words, anything you want to say, and before we get to the...
Well, thank you for listening, everybody. And I think we just really want to have a dialogue around these things. I think there are things that we don't talk about that a lot of us, are walking around, internalizing, not processing, bypassing, not looking at, in the way that we should, to bring conscious awareness to the patterns that we've been in. And so I would just encourage everybody who's listening to open up your mind. You might feel some defensiveness around that and protecting this kind of image or this way of being that's been there. But this will actually allow you to deepen your relationship with God, deepen your faith and your spirituality, whatever that practice is, because it's going to take away the trauma personality out of the relationship dynamic and bring in the authentic self.
Yeah, and I would say take some time today to go outside after you listen to this episode. If you were triggered, or if you felt a certain way about it, take some time, go outside, grab a journal, grab a pen, write down what you're feeling. What exactly are you feeling from this episode and what was brought up in this episode, and take some time to journal, be with yourself, maybe even take your shoes and socks off, get grounded, and do that for yourself, and come back to your notes and then bring that into someone who can be an empathetic witness for your experience.
Yes, absolutely. Well said. Love that.
All right. Well, thanks, Dr. Keean. We will join each other again very soon for part 4. Thanks for coming on again, and much appreciation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited for the next one.
Thank you for checking out Entrepreneurs in Recovery podcast. We are so appreciative that you are here. Make sure you go ahead and like and subscribe to the show on YouTube. Leave a review on iTunes and Spotify so more people can find the show. Once again, thank you so much. We have great episodes and content come out in the future. Thank you for being here. Have a blessed day.